Oh my goodness, thank you so much for inviting me here to speak with you all tonight. Many of you I have met and do know, and I just want to say hi, friends. Thank you for coming out tonight. So many lovely, wonderful friends. Oh, hi, y'all. So it's just so good to see you all out here tonight. And I know many of you are fellow history fans yourselves, and so therefore you probably are already well familiar with the Myers house. I'm going to ask you a question. How many of you have not been to the Myers house? Oh, okay, a few, okay. Well, hey, that's great for me because I thought I would be preaching to the choir up here. I thought, oh, these people already know this history. So I'm very glad to be sharing some of this information with people who maybe have never heard it before, but also I hope for the people who are well familiar with the Myers house that you will maybe hear or see something that is new to you. I'm trying to get this microphone just at the right angle. There we go. All right, so the Myers house is within walking distance of this building. It's 323 East Freemason Street, Norfolk, Virginia, and we are open Saturdays and Sundays. We are always free. I'm going to start the tour in the tour with that. The main focus of the Myers house is Moses Myers. He was born in New York City to Rachel Luzada and Chaim Myers. And I'm going to go a little bit further back in history than we normally do for a general tour at the Myers and talk a little bit about his mother's family. So Rachel Luzada and her ancestors, Rachel Luzada's family had been in America since maybe as early as the 1680s. But we know that Moses Luzada, Rachel's father, had been at least in New York City since 1728. And the reason we know that is because we have this list from Sharith Israel of people who contributed funds to the building of the first synagogue in British North America. So this was the first purpose-built synagogue, the Mill Street Synagogue in New York City. And in case you can't see Moses Luzada's name, there it is, right up there. So 1728, they were already here in New York City. Now, Hannah Luzada, Moses Myers' grandmother, was widowed on September 11th, 1750. And because of the laws of primogeniture, the entire estate went to her eldest son. And for reasons beyond her control, he was either unwilling or unable to care for his mother. And she had to rely on the synagogue for financial support. And you see her writing this letter to the synagogue, and English was not her first language. The Luzadas were from the Iberian Peninsula, so they were Spanish or Portuguese, and this is part of the Jewish diaspora, right? So they're coming to America, probably fleeing what was still ongoing from the Spanish Inquisition. And here you see some non-standard spelling. So she takes the liberty to write, W-R-I-G-H-T, asking for provisions to see her through the winter, W-E-N-T-E-R. And those are some clues that English wasn't her first language. But you can see also from this letter, Moses's grandmother, on hard times. This family did not come from wealth, and that's important to remember. So she's widowed in 1750. She still has an unmarried daughter, Rachel. And if Hannah is on hard times, so is Rachel. It just so happened that there was a young immigrant from Amsterdam named Chaim Myers who had immigrated in 1750, and he had been appointed the shaket for Sharith Israel. So that's the butcher making the kosher meat. And for this task, he was given 10 pounds per annum, and he was allowed to keep the tongues of all the animals that he slaughtered. So there would always be food on the table. and that's important. So it was a match, and Chaim Myers married Rachel Luzada in 1751, and this is their ketubah, or marriage contract. And just later on that year, in 1752, Moses Myers was born. So Moses Myers came from very humble beginnings. We don't know a lot about his early education. We do know that there was a cultural emphasis on reading and writing, and Moses did know how to read and write. He also had an early facility with languages. So he, of course, knew English. He knew Spanish from his mother's side. He probably knew Dutch from his father's side because he had immigrated from Amsterdam. He knew Hebrew. He knew French because the family relocated to Quebec in 1763. And he probably also knew some Native American languages because his father had dealings with the Mohawks. He also did add to that French, oh no, I already said French, and German. So he had a facility with languages, and that would serve him well in his future career as a maritime merchant. He also, somewhere along the way, learned double entry accounting. So this is the same kind of accounting that you do at your bank, you know, a column for the debts and a column for the credits. And all of these things would serve him in his future career. But before he could get started and embark on his wonderful life as a maritime merchant, along came a little thing called the American Revolution. So the American Revolution breaks out when he's in his early 20s. And of course, he enlists. This is Joel Pratt's 2nd New York Battalion muster roll. And in case you can't see it right there in the middle column, there's Moses Myers, right down here. Yeah. So it says he is enlisted and he is in the hospital. And so he quickly finds that active duty military service, not his jam, and he musters out. And then he joins the firm of Isaac Moses and Company as a junior partner. So this is Isaac Moses, the senior partner of the firm, and he would stay in New York, and they sent Moses to a little island in the Caribbean called St. Eustatius, and this is right near, like between Antigua and St. Kitts. And this was a Dutch-held Caribbean island, and the British called it the Golden Rock because a lot of goods that were coming to the colonists and the Continental Army were coming to them through this island. And the Dutch were supposed to be neutral in the War of the Revolution, but again, the British wanted to stop the trade coming to the colonists, and so they declared war on the Dutch, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, and they sent Admiral George Rodney there to subdue the island. And he does. In February 3rd, 1781, he seizes the island. And this man was particularly, I'm going to say, greedy. He seized the tools of the laborer, the necessaries of the poor, the luxuries of the rich. He left no stone left unturned. He seized warehouses, he seized clothing, he seized private property of citizens, and he singled out the Jewish population for particularly harsh treatment. He arrested 101 Jewish merchants on the island and had them imprisoned in a warehouse for several days. And we know that Moses Myers was one of those merchants because his name appears on the Rodney rolls. And again, this is something that is newly digitized from the archives over in London, so yay for digitization of archives. But you can see Moses Myers' name right there at the bottom. So this is one of the clues that tell us exactly where he was when he was involved in the American Revolution. Now, George Rodney, when he captured these 101 men, some of them were detained on British prison ships, and some were just forcibly deported. And again, the harsh realities of the time, British prison ships killed more Continental Army soldiers than British bullets did. So I don't know whether or not Moses was on a British prison ship or was he just forcibly deported. Either way, what we do know is due to the actions of Admiral George Rodney, or due to his inaction in harrying the French West Indies fleet, the French West Indies fleet was able to make a rendezvous in the Chesapeake Bay, and you have the Battle of the Capes, and Cornwallis was not able to be resupplied and had to capitulate and surrender, right? So the events of St. Eustatia are one of the things that led to America winning the war of the American Revolution when we did. I think you guys already know that, but America 250, and it's kind of interesting to see it from a different angle. So in 1784, Isaac Moses, the senior business partner, wrote to the Continental Congress, and particularly the president of the Continental Congress, Thomas Mifflin, and he's trying to get a consular position for Moses Myers. And he says that he would like this in consideration of his sufferings in St. Eustatia in person and property on account of his love to his country. So I think that that's also really interesting and really telling. Moses was not given a consular position at that time, but later he's going to have some important stuff to do. So here's Moses. He gets back to New York and he's bankrupt. The firm that he worked for, Isaac Moses and Company, had gone bankrupt. So he needs to rebuild his life and career. And on Passover Eve, 1787, he increases both his outlook and his personal happiness by marrying a lovely young widow, Eliza Judah Chapman Myers. And in July, he and Eliza was already heavily pregnant at the time, board the ship Sincerity toward their new home, Norfolk, Virginia. In doing so, Moses and Eliza Myers become Norfolk's first permanent Jewish residents. Now, why everywhere that they could have gone in America, why did they choose Norfolk? Well, we think they chose us for three really good reasons. One, we had been burned to the ground. January 1st, 1776, Norfolk was burned to the ground. In fact, 10 years later, when the Myers disembarked, it was still largely in ruins. It was known as Chimney Town. This painting is by Benjamin Latrobe. Yes, Chimney Town, because that's all that was left were the chimneys. So Norfolk was rebuilding from the rubble of the Revolution, and Moses saw a lot of opportunity for growth in the rebirth of Norfolk. Another reason he moved here was we were the second most important port in America at that time, right behind New York City, and his business is shipping, so of course he's going to move to a good port town, natural deepwater harbor that we are. The third reason, and maybe the most important to Moses, in 1786, Virginia became the first state in the new United States to pass a statute of religious freedom. And this was 5 years before the Bill of Rights. So Moses knew that if he moved here, he could practice his religion freely and still do things like hold public office, and he wouldn't have to swear on a Bible, right? Because we had statute of religious freedom. So Moses and Eliza got their business going, and after about 5 years of living in Norfolk, they were doing well enough to purchase a large plot of land in 1791 on the corner of Bank Street, Catherine Street as it was then, and Freemason Street. And that is where their beautiful Federalist-style mansion still resides today, just about a block from here. So Moses was very civically active and engaged in his new adopted community. He sat on the Common Council from 1794 to 1800, and in 1795 served as president of the Common Council, which was similar to the position of mayor at the time. He served as a counsel to France and the Netherlands. He achieved the rank of major in the militia. He was a Freemason. He was appointed the superintendent of the Norfolk branch of the Bank of Richmond. He was a founder of the Norfolk Chamber of Commerce. He provided financial support to the Presbyterian Church and donated land on which a theater was built. And in 1827, he was appointed the customs collector for Norfolk and Portsmouth, a position he held until 1830, and then he passed away in 1835. 5 generations of the Myers family lived in that house until it became a museum in 1931. So just think about that. We have been a museum for 95 years now, and the contents of the house are largely intact. So about 75% of the furnishings that you see when you visit the Myers house are original to the very first generation of occupants, making this one of the most intact historic homes of its age anywhere in America. The Myers family may have been the only family to ever own the house, but they are not the only family to ever live there. The families of the people they enslaved also lived in the house, and the Myers had anywhere from 3 to 12 people enslaved at any given point in the first few generations of the family. And we think it's very important to recognize the stories and contributions of everybody who lived in that house. And so we're going to hear a little bit more about them today too, if we have time, which we will. And certainly if you come to the house, you can hear more about them. So we interpret the house how it looked in 1819. And the reason we chose that year in particular is the Myers family suffered a second bankruptcy in 1819. And the bank came through and did an inventory of the entire house, room by room. And we use this handwritten inventory to interpret what furniture goes in each room. So when we decided to go with this 1819 interpretation, we had to find out what colors were on the walls. This is the drawing room as it looked circa 2005, and they did a paint analysis. And when they dug underneath all that white paint that you see on the fireplace, lo and behold, they struck gold. 22.5 carat gold leaf, 2 layers thick, was buried underneath all of that white paint. And so we had to ask ourselves, well, this is real gold on this fireplace. Why would anybody paint over it? Well, 1819, they had a bankruptcy. Maybe they painted over it to downplay their wealth. Or maybe it was just styles change. I don't know. I always do think, okay, Federalist architecture is, the beauty of geometry and simplicity, and maybe the gold was a little bit ostentatious, and so maybe that's why they painted over it. The Myers had 12 children during their marriage, 9 of whom lived to adulthood, 6 boys, 3 girls. So I'm just going to go through the names here. So there's John. He was born in 1787. Then they had a little boy named Abram who sadly passed away in infancy. And then Sam, more on him in a second. Those of you who know what's coming there. Then they had the charming eldest daughter, Adeline, who was a family favorite. And then Myers, who would be one of the few Myers children to outlive his father and eventually take over the family business. And had they stopped there, it would have been a fine family, but they didn't stop there. They had another little boy named Moses, and then Frederick, Augusta, Abram, Henry, another infant daughter, and then finally in 1807 married Georgiana, or Georgie as the family liked to call her, and she was the baby of the family. So, ladies, think about this. 12 pregnancies, and 13 actually, if you count her pregnancy to her first husband. Every time Eliza got pregnant, she was rolling the dice on whether or not she would survive that pregnancy. This was a time before germ theory. There was no modern medicine, no antibiotics, no pain relief, and she did it 12 times. I don't know how. And her last pregnancy, she was in her mid-40s, right? So John, the eldest son of the family, was kind of the standard bearer for the children and really a right-hand man for his father. He kind of was in charge of his own finances at the age of 13, and he became a full partner with his father in 1809 at the age of 21. John was a very civically engaged young man. He was on the Board of Inspectors. He served as consul to Sweden and Colombia. He achieved the rank of major in the militia. He was also a Freemason, like his dad. He was active in local politics and a member of the fire company. He was also a founding member of the Thespian Society, and this was a group of actors who would put on plays, and then they would donate all the proceeds to widows and orphans. So it was a very civically minded organization. During the War of 1812, John was aide-de-camp to General Robert B. Taylor, and who successfully won the Battle of Craney Island. And he became the assistant collector of customs for Norfolk and Portsmouth in 1827, and sadly he died of apoplexy in 1830. And then there's Sam. Sam is the second eldest son of the Myers family, and we believe that he was the first Jewish graduate of the College of William and Mary, where he studied law. However, history would find him on the other side of the law. And I am going to tell this story and share a little bit of family scandal with you, because this family has it all, and it's very interesting. So on May 24th, 1811, Moses Myers and a former business associate named Richard Bowden had gotten into an argument in Market Square. Richard Bowden struck Moses Myers with his cane. After Moses had walked away from the argument, Richard Bowden came up behind him and struck him with his cane. And bystanders pulled the two men apart, carried Moses back to his counting house. But that night, or some say it was the next morning, May 25th, 1811, Sam grabbed one of his father's pistols, marched into Richard Bowden's counting house, and murdered him. And Sam was indicted on murder charges. Actually, they had a very hard time finding anybody to prosecute, and there were some questions about who actually had jurisdiction to try this murder case. So there was a lot of legal entanglements there. But the family had the means to hire the very best lawyers, Mr. Taylor, who would later go on to be a hero of the War of 1812, and Mr. Tazewell, who would later go on to be governor of Virginia. So it was a legal dream team, and they made the argument that the charge should really be lowered to manslaughter, and then, if you try him for manslaughter after you'd already indicted him for murder, that's double jeopardy. And so they got him acquitted on a technicality. And eventually, Sam was released. He spent the rest of 1812, part of 1813, traveling Europe. He eventually does come back to America, where he marries Louisa Marks, a young lady from Richmond, and it is through their children that the house actually comes to us today. I do also want to put a shout out that Sam did spend some time in Pensacola, Florida, which is my hometown, but the environment agreed with him about the same as it agrees with me, and that is not at all. So he came back to Virginia. Adeline, as I said, was the oldest daughter of the family. She was charming, beautiful, accomplished. We have a copy of her sampler on display at the Myers house, and this shows us that the girls were educated. They could read, write, and sew. The little poem that she has at the bottom of her sampler says, "The happiest man ever breathed on earth, with all the glory of estate and birth, had yet some anxious care to make him know, no grandeur was above the reach of woe." So that's pretty heavy for a 7-year-old, but it would come into play a little bit later on in her life, and I'm going to tell you that story in a minute. So Myers, their third eldest son, would go on to take the reins of the family business after his father's death. He was actually one of the longest lived of the Myers children. He was still residing in the Myers house during the American Civil War, and he was in his 70s, and he is part of the reason that the house survived that occupation. Um, yeah. He married Judith Marks, Louisa's sister. So two of the Myers brothers married two Marks sisters from Richmond, but they had no children. Augusta, the second eldest daughter, was kind of a little rebel in the family, and when her older brother John had come home from school, he reported back to Sam that during his whole 2-week visit, he had saw Augusta in nothing but pants. So she was running around wearing pants, and her older brother didn't like it. She eventually turned out to be quite a charming young lady, and she married Philip Cohen, and together they had several children. But she passed away in 1876. Frederick Myers, their fourth eldest son, is the one who really saved the house after the 1819 bankruptcy. So whereas the three elder sons had gone into business with their father, Frederick went into business for himself. And when the family had that bankruptcy in 1819, Frederick was able to keep his finances separate and purchase the house on behalf of the family. So the house is in his name. He immediately makes his will, and he wills his family house and savings to his unmarried sisters. So when he died, sadly in his early 30s, Mary Georgiana, the youngest child of the Myers family, actually inherited the house. So the house is in her name until her death in 1862. And that's going to cause some issues too, and I'll get into that here in a moment as well. So Abram was their fifth eldest son. He was a very intelligent young man, but very sickly. And sadly, at the age of 21, he got an ear abscess, and he passed away in the middle of the night so quietly that his brothers and sisters had no idea he had even passed. Henry Myers, the youngest son in the family, joined the Navy against his parents' wishes, and he was given orders. He was on America's second trip to China. It was his first trip for the Navy, so he got to visit China, but on his second voyage for the Navy, he was aboard the USS Hornet, and they were patrolling around the Caribbean. They picked up a very unfortunate passenger in the form of yellow fever. Many of the sailors got sick, but only one sailor died, and that was Henry Myers. He passed away 3 days before reaching home in Norfolk, and he was given a burial at sea. So if you come to visit the house, you can see his naval dirk and his octant that they sent home in his place. So Mary Georgiana was the youngest child of the family, and she was everybody's favorite. If you can imagine, her older brother John was 20 years old when she was born. So, old enough to really be her father. So they all looked at Georgie as their beloved little darling baby sister. As I said, she inherited the house as a young woman. And of course, this made her a very, very, very eligible bachelorette because she has this glorious house. She is charming and beautiful like her other sisters. And men came courting. But remember, her father is still alive. Her older brothers are still alive. They're living in the house even though it's in her name. And they were not too keen on the idea of Georgie getting married. Why? Because if she gets married, who does the house go to? Her husband, right? And so they sent Georgie away to live with Augusta for a while. And Augusta, we know all this because Augusta writes back to Myers, and she says, I think you all have been too hasty in this business regarding Georgie. She's a very sensible young woman. I have told her to take a year to see what is to be seen, and then if she still wants to be married, it's easily done. But I think you've been too much involved in this, and you have to let Georgie make the decision. Eventually, Georgie comes back to Norfolk, and she never married. So the family kept the house. So if you come to visit the house, you will see the long dining room. This was an addition to the house built between 1805 to 1810 to accommodate the family's growing prominence in the community and their growing numbers, let's be honest. That was a lot of kids to fit around a table, and they probably needed a big dining room. The dining room table that you see there was made by James Woodward, a local cabinet maker and undertaker, so that's kind of fascinating. The chairs are Hepplewhite Shieldback chairs. All the mirrors are original, and currently, if you visit the house right now, everything on the table, besides the blue and white china, is also original. So we have their Spode teacups, their candlesticks, and their cut glass ware. So it's really amazing. This room served many purposes, including balls, banquets, and plays, and at least one wedding when Augusta was married. And we also have, let me see, no, I didn't put it in. So we get questions a lot about, because the Myers were Jewish, were they able to keep kosher? And the answer is sadly no. There was no community here to support their dietary needs. So we have food ledgers of Moses doing the shopping every day and what he's buying. And we know from those ledgers that he was buying oysters, shellfish, they had turtle soup on special occasions, which is also not kosher, and sometimes hams from Smithfield. So they definitely weren't keeping kosher. This is the parlor. This was the old dining room before they built that big dining room. But when they built the big dining room, they turned it into a parlor, and they were able to bring in their musical instruments. All of the family were musical. All the children played this pianoforte. The family, so they all played piano. Adeline played the harp. John played the clarinet. Myers played the violin. Together they had over 900 pieces of sheet music, which some say is the largest private collection of music in America prior to the Civil War. And that entire music collection is still intact in our Gene Outland Chrysler Library. And music historians have found songs in the Myers collection that they thought were lost to history. So we have the only surviving copies of some songs. So it is a pretty remarkable thing, and this is one of their bound albums. We also have a very famous pair of dueling pistols, and I talked to a few of you about this before the program. So John Myers went on his grand tour of England and Europe when in 1810, after he completed his education. When his brother Sam murdered Richard Barton, John cut his trip short and he came home, and he brought these pair of dueling pistols with him. Now, he never used them in any duels that we know of, but they were used in a very famous duel, the duel between Commodore James Barron of Hampton, Virginia, and the great naval hero Stephen Decatur. So if you want to come and hear that whole story, you have to come to the house, and I may even let you reenact the duel, not with the actual guns though. Yes, but sadly and historically, the gun that killed Stephen Decatur is the one in front of the case, and it has a notch under the trigger guard to indicate that it was the gun used in that fatal duel. Upstairs, we have the Myers' primary bedroom. Again, most of the furniture is original. This is the very bed that they slept in and the bed that Moses died in. It's another James Woodward piece, so the same guy that made the dining room table. And acorn on the headboard is a symbol of wealth and prosperity. So, good for the Myers. On the third floor, we have the nursery, and so this is where the children stayed until they were 12 or 13 years of age, and that's when they were considered adults in the Jewish faith. It was only then that they were allowed to come out of the nursery and have a bedroom on the second floor. And as I said, John, we know at the age of 13, he was given a ledger and $3 investment, and his father had already taught him the double entry accounting, so John was expected to then manage his own finances. He took that $3 investment and he bought shingles, which he sent to Martinique, and he got a $14 return on that $3 investment, which was great. And then he took his $14 return, he bought more shingles, sent them to Martinique, and he got $21 investment. So he was off to the races. He was doing good. His father taught him well. This is Adeline's room. It's a room that likely would have been shared by the girls once they were teenagers. And I told you I would go back to the story of Adeline. So in March of 1811, she was being courted by 3 different men, Captain Donaldson, a Mr. Ben Myers, and a G.W. She had already turned down Captain Donaldson because he wasn't Jewish, so he was not a good match. But she was still weighing her options between Ben Myers, no relation, and G.W., whoever that was. But what happens 2 months later in May of 1811? Her brother Sam murdered Richard Bowden. What do you think that did for Adeline's chances of marriage, right? Nobody wants to marry a girl with a big scandal going on in the family. So it wasn't until 1819 she met and fell in love with a man named Solomon Nunez. And according to the family, I have to say according to the family because there's no written evidence of it, but according to the family, they were engaged. And 2 days before their wedding day, Solomon Nunez died. And he was the first Jewish adult to die in our community. There was not even a Jewish cemetery here yet. And so Moses Myers, Philip Cohen, who would later go on to marry Augusta Myers, and Benjamin Nunez, Solomon's brother, all pitched in to establish the first Jewish cemetery for our community. It was the Washington Powder Point Cemetery, and it was in the Berkeley neighborhood of what is now South Norfolk. That cemetery was there from 1819 till about the mid-1850s when it was relocated. Now, when the Myers adult children began to die, Abram and then Frederick, they buried them in the Washington Powder Point Cemetery right next to Solomon Nunez. So it does indicate some sort of close family relationship. When that cemetery was relocated, they relocated those graves to the Hebrew cemetery at Princess Anne. Nobody knows where Moses Myers is buried. His grave is lost, which is very sad. So in 2012, an artist named Beth Lippman came to the Myers house, and she was given a tour by one of the gallery hosts. And while on that tour, she was told a ghost story in Adeline's room, and it inspired her to make this contemporary art installation called Adeline's Portal. So every single piece of glass that you see there was created in a 2-week time period in the Chrysler Glass Studio and represents an object that you can still find in the house. So you have Adeline's sampler on the back wall, and some beautiful candlesticks, and our bird cage, which you can actually see in the parlor if you come and visit. And Beth Lippman is asking us to consider what is more important, the truth or the legend. And yeah, it's one of the rare examples of a contemporary art installation woven beautifully into the actual interpretation of a historic house. It truly is a beautiful piece. So here we have the 1795 kitchen, and it would have been one of the busiest rooms in the house. This is where the people who were enslaved to the Myers lived and worked and slept. There were rooms above the kitchen, and then later when they built the big dining room wing, they bricked in the hyphen, and there were rooms above the hyphen for the people who were enslaved to them. The work in this kitchen was hot, difficult, and dangerous. We know what we know about the people who were enslaved to the Myers through their archives. And like I said, we have many names, but it is very hard to piece the puzzle pieces together when you only have a few documents to tell the story. So this letter is very interesting. It's from a woman named Hannah Kemp. She's writing to John Myers. She's trying to convince him to buy her enslaved servant, Robin. She says she had been offered $600 for him, but would be willing to take $500 because her late husband had promised Robin if they ever had to sell him that they would try to get him sold in Norfolk so that he could remain close to his wife. She says, respecting Robin's character, I believe him to be truly honest, a good gardener, and a good hostler, all of which sounds like she's saying lovely things about Robin. But really, she is leveraging Robin's good skills, Robin's good reputation, and Robin's family connections to make a sale. And she does make that sale. We also have a few clues about what happened to some of the people who were enslaved to Myers. So you may ask yourself, did they ever free any of their enslaved servants? And they did, but not for free. So this letter says, as Henry wishes to be made free, I have agreed to release him on paying me for 7 1/3 months at $5 a month, plus $36.67 for a total of $126.67. A thing to remember about this is that once Henry was manumitted, he was not allowed to remain in the state of Virginia. He had to leave the state because that was the law at the time. Now, Moses did business all over the Atlantic, and his ships went to all of these different ports of call, carrying cargo like molasses, tobacco, lumber, manufactured goods, porcelain, china. And we know all of this because we have the bills of sale. So, the bills of lading, we have the bills of lading. So they tell us all the places he went. And one of the things I can tell you is that Moses Myers never engaged in the slave trade for business practice. He did have people enslaved domestically to him, but it wasn't part of his business practice. It would have been illegal for him to do that after 1808 anyways. That's not to say that his sons didn't engage in human trafficking and through the intra-American slave trade, but I know we're running short on time. I'm going to say I can do a whole lecture about this, so please invite me back to hear more. I have to talk a little bit about Barton Myers. So Barton Myers is the great-grandson of Moses Myers. By the time Barton Myers was born, the family had converted to Christianity, so he was raised as Episcopalian. By the time that he was 35 years old, he had already founded 2 factories, been president of the Norfolk Western Railway, president of the Chamber of Commerce, and mayor of Norfolk. But one of the most important things that he did for us was in 1907, he served on the board of trustees for the Jamestown Exposition. So this was going to be a great big World's Fair type event to celebrate the tricentennial of Jamestown. And he owned the land on which the exposition was going to be held. And he had it set up with plumbing and electricity. Now, the electricity was a big deal in 1907. So the exposition came, and it lasted all year and spurred a lot of great growth in our community. But what was important is what happened after the exposition. So after the exposition was over, Barton lobbied the U.S. government. He's like, hey guys, I know you're looking for a place on the East Coast to establish a permanent Navy base. Guess what? Norfolk's a great natural deep water harbor. We're centrally located on the mid-Atlantic. We're right next to a shipyard, and I happen to have this huge piece of land already set up with plumbing and electricity. Well, you come and build your new Navy base here. And they did. So July 4th, 1917, the world's largest Navy base opened here in Norfolk, Virginia. We're about to celebrate our 110th anniversary next year. And we are still the largest Navy base in the world. So I want to wrap this up by saying, as we can see, it is amazing the impact that one family can have on a community. When Moses moved here, he was in search of new opportunities. He was wondering, how can I rebuild my life in this community that has been devastated by the Revolutionary War? And it was Moses Myers' generation that laid the foundation on which future generations would build. And his great-grandson, Barton Myers, certainly did build on that foundation. So I hope I've given you a lot to think about today. I hope we've thought about some themes that resonate in our own lives about hope and resilience and perseverance through hardship. And I would love to open it up for questions.
Well, I have one.
Yes.